Today we're going to start looking at a short story called Lamb to the Slaughter by the writer Roald Dahl. Now, of course, all of you, I assume, will have read at least one Roald Dahl book in your lives. Boy, The Witches, Matilda, James and the Giant Peach. But you may not be aware that Roald Dahl, before he became a children's author, wrote stories for a more adult audience. Now, those of you who know Dahl's children's books will know that he has a very, very dark sense of humour. Think about the fate of all of the dreadful children in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, or how dark the characters are in The Twits, how the witches in The Witches are truly terrifying child killers, or how George poisons his granny in George's Marvellous Medicine. Dahl's adult stories are also very, very dark and very, very twisted. They are short, and they always have an unexpected twist or two, usually at the end. Now today I'm going to read you the opening to the story Lamb to the Slaughter, up to the point that something unexpected happens. So listen very carefully. The room was warm. The curtains were closed. The 2 table lamps were lit. On the cupboard behind her there were 2 glasses and some drinks. Mary Maloney was waiting for her husband to come home from work. Now and again she glanced at the clock, but without anxiety. She merely wanted to satisfy herself that each minute that went by made it nearer the time that he would come home. As she bent over her sewing, she was curiously peaceful. This was her 6th month expecting a child. Her mouth and her eyes seemed larger and darker than before. When the clock said 10 minutes to 5, she began to listen. And a few moments later, punctually as always, she heard the car tyres on the stones outside, the car door closing, the footsteps passing the window, the key turning in the lock. She stood up and went forward to kiss him as he entered. "Hello, darling," she said. "Hello," he answered. She took his coat and hung it up. Then she made the drinks. A strong one for him and a weak one for herself. And soon she was back again in her chair with her sewing. And he was in the other chair, holding the tall glass, rolling it gently so that the ice knocked musically against the side of her glass. For her, this was always a wonderful time of day. She knew he didn't want to speak much until the first drink was finished, and she was satisfied to sit quietly, enjoying his company after the long hours alone in the house. She loved the warmth that came out of him when they were together. She loved the shape of his mouth, and she especially liked the way he didn't complain about being tired. "Tired, darling?" "Yes," he sighed. "I'm thoroughly exhausted." And as he spoke, he did an unusual thing. He tilted his glass and drank it down in one swallow, although there was still half of it left. He got up slowly and went to get himself another. "I'll get it," she cried, jumping up. "Sit down," he said. When he came back, she noticed that the new drink was a very strong one. She watched him as he began to drink. "I think it's a shame," she said, "that when someone's been a policeman as long as you have, he still has to walk around all day long." He didn't answer. "Darling," she said, "if you're too tired to eat out tonight, as we'd planned, I can fix you something. There's plenty of meat and stuff in the freezer." Her eyes waited for an answer, a smile, a nod, but he made no sign. "Anyway," she went on, "I'll get you some bread and cheese." "I don't want it," he said. She moved uneasily in her chair. But you have to have supper. I can easily fix you something. I'd like to do it. We can have lamb, anything you want. Everything's in the freezer." "Forget it," he said. "But darling, You have to eat. I'll do it anyway, and then you can have it or not, as you like. She stood up and placed her sewing on the table by the lamp. Sit down, he said. Just for a minute, sit down. It wasn't until then that she began to feel a bit frightened. Go on, sit down. She lowered herself into the chair, watching him all the time with large, puzzled eyes. He had finished his second drink and was staring into the glass. Listen, he said. I've got something to tell you. What is it, darling? What's the matter? He became absolutely motionless, and he kept his head down. This is going to be a big shock to you, I'm afraid, he said. But I've thought about it a good deal, and I've decided that the only thing to do is to tell you immediately. And he told her. It didn't take long, 4 or 5 minutes at most. And she sat still through it all, watching him with puzzled terror. So there it is, he added. And I know it's a tough time to be telling you this, but there simply wasn't any other way. Of course, I'll give you money. I'll see that you're taken care of, but there really shouldn't be any problem. I hope not. In any case, it wouldn't be very good for my job. Her first instinct was not to believe any of it. She thought that perhaps she'd imagined the whole thing. Perhaps, if she acted as though she'd not heard him, she would find out that none of it had ever happened. I'll fix some supper, she whispered. When she walked across the room, she couldn't feel her feet touching the floor. She couldn't feel anything except a slight sickness. She did everything without thinking. She went downstairs to the freezer and took hold of the first object she found. She lifted it out and looked at it. It was wrapped in paper, so she took off the paper and looked at it again. A leg of lamb. All right then, they'd have lamb for supper. She carried it upstairs, held the thin end with both of her hands. She went into the living room, saw him standing by the window with his back to her and stopped. I've already told you, he said. Don't make supper for me. I'm going out. At that point, Mary Maloney simply walked up behind him without any pause. She swung the big frozen leg of lamb high in the air and brought it down as hard as she could on the back of his head. She might as well have hit him with a steel bar. She stepped back, waiting. And the strange thing was that he remained standing there for at least 4 or 5 seconds. Then he crashed onto the carpet. The violence of the crash, the noise, the small table overturning helped to bring her out of her shock. She came out slowly, feeling cold and surprised, and she stood for a few minutes looking at the body, still holding the piece of meat tightly with both hands. All right, she told herself. So I've killed him. So we'll pause the story there at that pretty amazing cliffhanger. Now, I bet you none of you expected in the first minutes of that story that it would result in that shocking murder. It's a twist, an unexpected twist. Now, we will continue the story next time, but for now, look at the slides presentation shared with you and complete the tasks that focus on the opening of this story.